star. You will never get there. In stillness, fingers reach for the golden thread. The inner voice that is so frequently misread. Sorrow's army as a boundless force. So drop your burdens and your parcels of remorse. Every seed will one day just leave us. Use your time well, because it's lonesome you love and Today is heroism. Today is falling away. We're not confined to ashes. We are the link, not the chain.
Hello, welcome to the Songwriting Discovery Talk. I'm Cabarrus, delighted that you've come to join us. So today we're going to be talking about how you can use the ideas from great composers, ideas that have been used throughout the ages to enhance your songs. And I have a very special guest today. Some of you may recognize him. He is a master music coach and guitar instructor. He spent over 20 years mentoring and training, literally at this point, thousands of students. And when I first encountered his content, it was pretty much like a whole bank of spotlights got turned on. And there were things that I hadn't really understood before. I didn't know what they could do. And suddenly I was able to use them and apply them in my writing. So I'm delighted to have him right here with us. Welcome, Tom Hess.
Hello. Thank you, Deanna.
And I've, got the chance to ask all these questions. I already know that I'm really going to enjoy this because I love the insights that I've learned in the past, and I think all viewers will find that Tom Hess is able to explain things in a very clear and easy to apply way. So that is what we're going to talk about today. So when I started out in songwriting, the other songwriters I knew behaved as if songwriting was pretty much the kind of magical activity. I'm just a person, I'm going to, now I've got a song. And who knows how that happened. And I think when we do a thing, but we don't know how we did it, we can easily therefore decide that it can't be known. I did a thing, I can't explain how I did it, therefore it's not explicable. It can't be known, it can't be explained, it can't be broken down. And I think lots of people have written songs, they don't know quite how they did it, and it works pretty well, and they're like, oh well, this is cool. But it seems sort of like a magical thing, and because it's all happening under the bonnet of your sort of conscious awareness, you lots of people don't necessarily therefore think that it's something that can be broken down. But in fact, there are lots of aspects of songwriting that are absolutely subject to rules and conventions and have effects that we can understand and use deliberately. And I always think it's very dangerous for people to give a lot of mysteriousness to songwriting and to good songs. Of course, great art, it has got this kind of like wonderful has a kind of mysterious effect on us, but the source of what makes a piece of music sound a certain way isn't mysterious. And to pretend that it is just because you don't know how you wrote that particular song it makes it an excluding thing. So I'm interested in today's topic, not just because of the practical aspects of what we're going to talk about, but also from that perspective that people can confer an unreal level of mystery onto songwriting simply because they themselves cannot articulate or define what the components of it are. So when it comes to classical music, a lot of us have had some exposure to it, but less exposure perhaps than we've had to contemporary music. Let me just hang on a sec. You're back. So yeah, it can seem pretty complex in comparison with songs that we've heard, pop songs and rock songs that we've grown up with. Classical music can seem like a little bit excluding, like we can enjoy the experience of it, but it's a kind of whole complex thing. And it can seem a little unconnected what we do as songwriters. But is it? Or are there in fact principles that composers have used for centuries or have used a lot that could actually be things that we could apply in our own approach to songwriting? what aspects of a modern rock or pop song might be more closely related than we would imagine to classical music, in your opinion?
Great question. So, yeah, first of all, obviously there are a lot of differences in style and approaches and reasons between people who are writing music in the classical era. So, just to define our terms, when we're talking about classical music, or at least when I'm speaking of classical music, I'm referring to the period of between about 1600 and 1900, also known as the common practice period, 1600 and 1900. In those periods, that large period contains basically three eras in music: the Baroque era, which goes from about 1600 to about 1750. That was the year that Bach died. That's why it's marked at 1750. And then the classical era, which was about 1750, maybe a little bit before, until around the 1820s. And then the Romantic era, which is about 1820s up until about 1900. So that's what, at least that's what I'm talking about when we talk about the big picture of classical music, not to be confused with the classical era of 1750, about 1820. Okay, now that we got that out of the way. So in the Baroque era, the first of those three eras, most of the music was pretty much diatonic in terms of harmony. So at that time, chords didn't exist as a concept. Composers of the time, like Bach and his contemporaries, Vivaldi and Purcell and others around that time, they didn't use the word chord in any language. They didn't have the concept of chord. Music then was just a bunch of melodies happening at the same time that worked well together. Okay. Now, for us, when we look back at that music, we can see what looks to us like chords. Oh, here's a chord, here's a chord, here's a chord. Okay. But the chords would essentially change sometimes every note in a melody or every few notes in a melody. But the point is that they didn't have a concept of chord. That came later, okay, in later periods. But if we go back and look at it, we see that most of the chords are right in the key. Sometimes they would step out of the key using chords like secondary dominants. But basically, it's mostly diatonic harmony in the early Baroque period and in the eras before that. That is still kind of mostly the case in pop music and a lot of rock music. It's just tonal music, mostly stuff, chords from in a key. So that's something that carried over and hasn't changed a lot in a big way in terms of today's popular music and early Baroque music of the time. It was mostly sounds very different, but still basically made up of what we would call the same kinds of chords. So that's one thing that's different. It's mostly chords that are in a key, tonal music. That's basically the same. Phrase length is about the same. The length that phrases or melodies has stayed pretty consistent over the centuries. And that, when you really think about it, that's kind of surprising that phrase lengths remained fairly consistent. There's some variance, of course, but that's one thing that is carried over that is still, you hear it all the time today. We don't have very, very, very long phrases. As you think might have occurred as music evolved, you might expect that phrase length would get bigger, but that didn't really happen most of the time. And then the last thing here in this category is rhythm, consistent rhythm. So in Western music, so we're not talking about music from India or Japan or countries like that, but in Western, let's say just European culture, that would include Russia in terms of music, Russian composers out through England, that the consistency of rhythm is pretty constant, meaning that if a piece of music in the Baroque era or the classical era started off with a certain set of rhythms, it typically remained fairly constant throughout. And we see that in pop music and rock music. There are some exceptions or some variants, but the variances are not big. Okay. They're not, you don't see a lot of progressive, multiple time signatures, odd meter, polyrhythms. You don't see a lot of that in modern music that's not like prog rock stuff, just like you didn't see that stuff in the Baroque era, the classical era, and you really didn't see much of that in the Romantic era either. So tonal music is still with us for the most part, mostly diatonic harmony, are in both cases for the Baroque era at least, and then also for most pop music. Phrase length is about the same, and consistency of rhythm has been. Those are the four main things that have really kind of stuck in terms of elements that are the same over hundreds and hundreds of years. There are other similarities too, but those are kind of the big obvious ones.
I had never considered phrase length. That's a really interesting observation. And when you said that, I was thinking, is that because of we run out of air? But that's not really. It's kind of. But then stringed instruments, they could play for as long as they wanted. But
Yes, but yes to both parts. Yes.
so I think maybe there's a sort of probably one day they'll discover that we've got a certain RAM where we can kind of like compute the melodic sense, and it only lasts a certain amount of time, then we run out and it resets. Yeah, so that's fascinating. And in all those things you say are very kind of recognizable today in terms of the types of time signature that we have, and it hasn't been massively, a new system hasn't really been created, and there have been some kind of attempts at that, and there was Schoenberg and Pierre Boulez and all those guys doing more experimental stuff, but it didn't really stick. People were not that into it. So what might be some of the main differences about between how a classical composer might think and how a songwriter might think? So in the beginning, I expressed my view that lots of songwriters, because they come to it in an informal way, and they do it in quite a spontaneous and instinctive way, and you don't need a whole ton of training to improvise a melody and choose a chord. So it can and has been done by people with no formal music training, and I'm all in favor of that, of getting started wherever you're at. But that is a very different starting point than being a composer and thinking, well, I've got to come out with a cantata for next Saturday, and I've got to direct the mass at this church, and the king is expecting a new ballet on his birthday. So what might be some of the differences that you know about?
Well, you just hit on some of the big ones, which the reasons that composers composed music over the centuries were very different then than they are now. And they were very different between eras. So in the Baroque era, you had a lot of sacred music, a lot of music being written for the church. Now, of course, there was secular music as well, but these musicians were employed by somebody. Okay, I mean, Bach was employed by the church. I mean, a lot of these people were employed either by the church or, which mainly came later on, like in the classical era, very, very, very wealthy families. In the Romantic era, it changed. Well, let me back up. Okay, so in the Baroque era, you've got music being written for the church that was literally like part of their job, as you alluded to, Deanna. There's a mass coming up on Sunday, and they need a new piece for the mass. Okay, so Bach might write an entire mass, which is a massive piece of music. No pun intended there. So there's a lot of work that had to be done in fairly short periods of time. And you might, which if you think about that for a moment, if you got to do a lot of work in a short period of time, you might need to rely on some formulas to crank some of these things out in a good music in a short period of time that is going to work. It's, when I say work, meaning it works musically, it works for the performers, it works for the organist, it works for the chorus. It has to functionally work. You can't be writing a bunch of experimental things that are going to be performed on Sunday or next Saturday night for the king's birthday, to use Deanna's analogy. It has to work. It has to be playable. Composers had to know and understand the ranges of what's the range on a clarinet, what's the pitch range of a violin, what is common. They had to know so much more about how those instruments are played. They didn't have to be experts in all those instruments, but they had to, at minimum, know what the ranges were. They had to know what the properties of the dynamic levels. There's certain instruments that, as you get higher in pitch range, they cannot play soft. They have to play loud. The instrument is not capable of playing high notes softly. And there are other instruments where it's not many, but there are some where it's the opposite. Only the low notes are allowed. You would have to know that stuff, and they did. So, so there were reasons writing for the church. In the classical era, they were often writing because they had patrons. So, the two biggest names in the classical era were Mozart and Haydn. And Haydn worked for a family for a long period of time called the Esterhazy family. And the Esterhazy family, they were very, very, very wealthy. They had many, many servants. And Haydn was essentially a servant. It's hard to imagine. I mean, Haydn is one of the biggest composers of all time, but he was really lower on the totem pole, lower in priority for the family than the cook. The cook was actually ranked higher. Okay, he made more. He was more respected. But Haydn was this great composer. Wrote 104 or 108 symphonies. Many of them were for this family, for their parties and so on. So you're writing because you're getting paid to write, and you're getting paid to write on a timeline. We want you to write this for this purpose by this date. Okay, and then in the Romantic era, things changed a little bit more. There were still patrons, but here you had publishing, which was a bigger source of money. People toured, and they toured before that as well. I mean, Mozart was on tour a lot, and you were writing a lot because you had to get your music published, because the publisher, that was the money you got from publishers, was a significant source of income. And if you wanted to eat, you had to sell your music. So that either meant you were performing all the time, or you were getting money from publishing, very much like record companies today, or bands today. You're either out on tour making money, or you're selling albums, you're selling songs or downloads or whatever, and making money. Back then, they weren't selling recordings, but they were selling copies of the published works. So in order to sell many copies, those things had to be playable. So what does that mean? So if you think about a singer, a songwriter, a band today, they're creating, if they're doing it professionally, they're creating music for the consumer, the listener, to listen and be entertained or whatever. The way the music is being consumed primarily is just by listening. You put on the recording, you listen to it. There's no skill involved really for the listener. They don't have to know a whole lot of anything about music to listen. They either like it or they don't. In the 19th century, 18th century, it was different. Okay, they were writing music for people to buy the sheet music so they could play it at home, because that's how people heard music if they didn't go to concerts, which most people didn't go to concerts. There was a keyboard or a violin or whatever at home, or maybe singers at home. And those people had to learn, or did learn, to play piano or sing or whatever. They had to learn how to read music. So they would buy the sheet music so that when they're at home on a Friday or Saturday night, they can just play music and have music in the house through somebody in the home playing it live. This is how it often happened at parties, and just, for their own entertainment and the very little free time that people had then. So you had to write music that people could play, a normal person could play. If you wrote a lot of complex stuff, you sold a whole lot less. So that was sometimes a consideration that they had to think about. Second thing is that, in the common practice period, 1600 to 1900, especially in the Baroque era, there were very few composers who played music and wrote music purely for fun, unless they were already very wealthy from something else. They came from a wealthy family where their money was always there, or there from some other source. And those musicians, if they didn't have to work, okay, they were one of the lucky ones. But for the vast majority of people, survival was priority number one. Not being hungry was priority number one. So they didn't have a lot of free time like people today do. It's not like you go to a job, you work a few hours a day, you come home, and then you sit on the couch and do whatever. Okay, they didn't have that. I mean, washing clothes was a monumental task. Cooking dinner was a monumental task. Getting the food to cook was a monumental task. Every aspect, going to the bathroom was a big deal. I mean, what are you going to do with it when you're done? They didn't have indoor plumbing. Okay, so every aspect of life was so much harder. There was so much less free time. There was not really time for goofing around playing for fun if you were a composer. So you mainly did it as a source of income, and they were often trained early on. So those are the main kind of the differences, that and music was to sell copies of published copies of works. Um, so the consumer had to be able to perform that or play it for themselves to hear it, not like selling a recording today where all they got to do is just sit back and listen and people can consume it that way. So the reasons were very different, and of course that affects what they're writing, how they're writing, who they're writing for what purpose. It's very different than today.
Yeah, I think there's a lot of songwriters that I've met start off with songwriting because they want to do it for fun, or they want to express something, or they simply want the enjoyment of something existing in the world that didn't exist before. And it's a bit of a discovery. If you've never combined those elements before, that's kind of exciting, and it can be very exhilarating. But that's very different than having an expressive goal for a piece of music that you're writing. You might decide that the ballet for King Hess's birthday needs to express intense exhilaration and triumph. That's not the same as feeling it while you're writing it. Whereas I think a lot of songwriters start from a kind of personally experienced set of emotions that they want to express through music. So I think that kind of goes along with what you're saying. It's a completely different starting point. But the pressure of having to grind out a lot of work and having to know how you're going to create the effect of triumph or despair gives us opportunities to understand how we can use that in our own writing, because you might have a songwriter might be experiencing a very powerful emotion, but that's not the same as understanding how they're going to translate that so that other people are going to experience that too. So what this is a little similar to the previous question, but what do we know about the attitudes or habits of thought classical composers may have adopted that might be surprising or useful? You've already kind of outlined how that their motivation is very different and their objective is very different. But what do we know from any lives of composers where they might have had habits that would be surprising to songwriters?
Yes, well, exactly. They had, as you mentioned earlier, they had a lot of pressure to write music that was being commissioned. In other words, they were being paid to write this piece of music in this style for this purpose by this date. So it didn't matter how they felt. I mean, it didn't matter if they were feeling sad and they wanted to write a sad piece of music. Party's coming up. You're paid to write for the party or you're out of here. So you can put your depression away and your mental health problems on the side. We don't care. We got a party and you have to write as if, you're happy as hell, but doesn't matter that you're all depressed. Doesn't matter. This is what we need you to do. And this is what you have to do, or we'll find someone else to do it. So they couldn't just, I feel this today, so I'm going to go write a song about it. I mean, if they had any free time, they could do that a little bit on the side. But this was a real job. Okay, it's just like if you have a day job today. Well, this was their day job, and they had to do what they had to do in order to earn money, because the alternative was worse and a lot worse. And whether it was writing for weekly church services or writing for wealthy people, or your publisher said, hey, we need a set of piano pieces on this level because we could sell a lot of these. Whatever it is, you had those needs and you kind of had to meet those needs. And other things that were written on the side were just that, things written kind of on the side, unless they were financially well off, which most really weren't. So anyway, then the next thing in this kind of category is that excellence mattered a great deal, even in pieces that appear to be simple. So there's some classical music when you look at it, like let's say Minuet in G by Bach. Okay, that's you've all heard it before. Very, very simple little piece of music. And on the surface, it might seem like, that's like really easy and really simple. Well, it is, but most songwriters today could never write that, even though it's simple and even though you can play it and it's not hard to play. Why couldn't they write it? Because they don't know the principles of counterpoint, because maybe they didn't study that. So, and then remaining in strict form, ABA form, a lot of songwriters are not aware of that because they don't have to stick to those principles of counterpoint. They're not forced to write with to a specific form. They can kind of do what they want, which is great, but then you don't really produce a result like that, even if it's simple. Following these principles of counterpoint is not always so simple, and it requires a lot of excellence in skill and craftsmanship to be able to do that, while at the same time trying to create melodies that are nice and people want to play and people want to hear it. So there was a lot more restriction in terms of objectives they were trying to meet and certain things they wanted to keep in mind while writing, that a common songwriter today doesn't really have to think about. I mean, they could think about it, but they just don't typically. So they're not thinking about things like counterpoint and sticking to a strict form. They may only think, well, the song's got to be less than 4 minutes. That might be the only restriction in terms of formal structure and time. So, yeah, so those are some differences there.
Yeah, I think songwriters who have started out purely kind of instinctively can have a fear that if they start being a little bit more deliberate, like, oh, well, this next section needs to express this. So, whether I'm in that mood or not, if the day comes when I want to write that bit and this is the time I've got, I need to find a way to try and translate that. I think they can be suspicious of that. And if anyone who's watching, if you've ever felt like that, you can trust yourself to be able to tap into anything you need to, and your mood doesn't have to dictate what it is that you're going to be able to do creatively. But when it comes to, for example, melody, do you think are there some easy to understand devices that we might recognize from the classical canon that songwriters can apply without necessarily knowing all of the things that a classical musician would know or classical composer would know about all the instruments and their ranges and the techniques and the types of things those instruments can play and all the rest of it?
Sure. Well, yes, one of those things would be the concept known as modulating pitch function. So this is a term that I created to describe this device. It's not my idea. I didn't create the concept. The concept's been around for centuries. There just wasn't a name to label this concept. And it's a very simple concept. And that basically is this. If you've got a set of notes or a melody, okay, and maybe that melody, let's say the melody's in the key of C major, and you're going to play the melody over, let's say, a C major chord. So all the notes of that melody are going to be compared to, by the listener, okay, the feeling of those notes is going to be in relation to that chord. So all those notes are going to feel a certain way because of the relationship those notes have with each other in the melody, but also the relationship they have with the underlying chord played in that moment, which in this example is C major. Well, if you repeat the same melody again, or section of melody again, but you change the chord, so nothing changes in the melody itself, the relationship between the pitches in the melody don't change because it's just simply being a repeated melody, but all these notes, their relationship with the underlying chord changes. And that difference of relationship is what causes the same melody to feel different to us when we hear it. So let's say you repeat this melody 4 or 5 different times, and every time it's repeated, the underlying chord and harmony changes. If that occurs, that's called modulating pitch function. Modulating just means to change. So what's changing here? The relationship between the melody and the underlying chord. Those relationships are changing. So the pitch function, the function of each note as it relates to each chord, is changing. And that is what creates the difference of emotion, even though the melody is being just repeated straight. So if the violinist is playing the melody, for him or her, they're doing exactly the same thing. But if the keyboard player is changing the chords, what they're doing is changing, and how they interact with each other is what changes the emotion of those melodies. So that's a core concept there that's pretty easy to understand. It's a device that's very easy to understand, that certain classical composers use, more so in the Romantic era than the others, but it was in that period of time that anyone can do. And oftentimes people do this in rock music or popular music or whatever. In heavy metal music, you hear it's often. Iron Maiden would be like the example that comes to my mind immediately. You've got a melody, you harmonize the melody, you change the chords. You got, E minor, D, and C over the exact same thing. And that's a perfect example of modulating pitch function. Another thing is melodic curves. So when you're writing a melody, that the nature or the relationship of how the notes move, notes get higher, the notes get lower. That melodic curve is very, very common, and it kind of looks like this. I mean, if you were to look at a textbook definition of a melody, and if it had a graph showing the curve of the melody, it probably would look something like this. Okay, so you're starting, this is pitch range. So this is lower notes. These are higher notes. Okay, and there's notes in the middle. So you'd probably start lower. There'd probably be a climactic point, maybe 2/3 of the way through. Okay, it might then come down a little bit. You might end up here, or you might come down here. This is the melodic curve. It's very typical. Now, there's more than one kind of melodic curve, but if you were looking at the textbook definition of a melodic curve, that's pretty much it. Okay, the note starts here, you climb up, there's a climax, and then you release that climax and you're done. That's the end of a single melody, or maybe even a phrase. So that kind of melodic curve, which was so common for centuries and centuries, is still common today. Not all music does that, but a lot of it does. It's very, very common. So melodic curves are concepts that anyone can use, taken right from centuries ago. Next is melodies in systematic phrase lengths. Okay, so what is that? What are systematic phrase lengths? Well, if you have a phrase, first of all, let's define our terms. A phrase is part of a melody. So if a melody is this long, this melody may be created by 2 phrases of equal length, or 3 phrases. We have 2 short phrases and 1 long phrase, or 4 short phrases. Those are not the only possibilities, but those are the most common ones. Okay, over millions and millions of pieces of music over centuries, even today. So let's go back to our melody. I'm not going to draw out the melodic curve. I'm just going to draw a straight line to represent time. Okay, so this is the start of our melody. This is the end of our melody. If you have 2 phrases, you have phrase 1 and phrase 2, and there's probably a rest between. So the singer sings this, the singer rests or breathes for a beat or half a beat or half a measure, whatever. Then there's a second phrase. And this phrase typically complements this phrase. Okay, so all together, you've got a full melody, but it's in typically equal phrase lengths. Okay, and a variation of this is you could have 4 little phrases. Okay, so now you'd have, think about the whole melody as being in quarters. Now you have 1 phrase, 2 phrases, 3 phrases, and 4 phrases, and all together they daisy chain together, and then they create one big longer melody. This is where the saxophone player breathes, or the singer, or the violin player stops, or the guitar player stops, pauses, okay, before going into the next melody or the next phrase. So this is very common in classical music, Baroque music, Romantic music. It's common today. It's common. You hear it in blues music, you hear it in rock music, you hear it all the time. So whether you're aware of it or not, you've heard it a million times, and it's a simple concept. Now, why would you do this? Why don't you just do one long continuous melody without any break, without any clear phrase? Well, you could, and some people do, but we know from hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of years that most listeners like to hear melodies in phrases. Okay, it typically sounds more melodic in the end. It's not a rule. It's just something that we know is common that people prefer to hear, because this music tended to be more popular than the alternatives, where there were not clearly defined phrases and it was just one big run-on sentence. So that's something that someone could easily just take and just start thinking about, writing melodies in systematic phrase lengths. Very, very common. Tends to help the melody sound more melodic, makes a little bit more sense. Another concept is the direction of how notes in a melody move. So earlier I drew an example of a melodic curve. Okay. Well, anytime that a melody goes up, okay, I shouldn't say anytime. I should say most times, or at least more than half of the time. When a melody is rising, the notes are getting higher and higher and higher, okay, in pitch range. Lower notes getting higher and higher and higher. As the notes increase, tension rises. This creates, everything else being equal, an ascending melody tends to create tension. A descending melody tends to release tension. Now, we can't really go only in one direction all the time. I guess you could for a little while, but eventually you're going to run out of room. You've got to come back down, or at the very least start over down here. So when you're looking at music that has a climax, or a melody that has a climactic point, typically the most emotional point tends to be right here. Okay. You're building tension, building tension, building tension. This is the melodic climax. And then that climax that tension has to be released. It has to be resolved somehow. And that's where things started to climb down or descend down like this. So this is a super common concept, been around for many centuries, that anyone can use. Just remember, I want to create tension, go up. You want to resolve the tension, go down. So you can, of course, find exceptions where you can create a melody which goes down that also creates tension. This does exist. It's harder to do that, but it's not impossible. And same thing in reverse. You could create melodies that go up that don't create a lot of tension. It is possible, but now you're relying on other musical elements to help you do that. But just all things being equal, you rise, you create tension, you fall, you lower tension. So, and that led to my final point on this, which is just building climax. Building a climax, you might suspend or sustain the climax for a few seconds, and then you resolve it down. So super common. Anyone can do it. Just simple concepts. Been done very well for many centuries.
What I think is really useful for songwriters about this is that because most people who write a song have listened to lots and lots of songs and a lot of music, they're going to be doing some of these things anyway, but they won't have necessarily defined or articulated that. And so if you have written songs already, you're watching this, go back through some of your previous songs and see how you've treated your melodies and where you've naturally ended your phrases and where the notes have changed. And you'll see that you're already doing some of these things anyway, but being able to handle them deliberately is going to make a massive difference to how many options you have and how you can sort of sculpt the character of your own songs and really get your own style. It's not just generic or the first thing that comes out. So I think these are really helpful reflections, and we can apply all of them to we'd apply all of them to any piece of music we heard. We'd be able to look at the attributes of the melodies in these ways. When you were talking about the modulating pitch function, I was just thinking about everyone loved U2 in the town I grew up in. And all the edges guitar, new bass note, the chords are changing underneath that little guitar riff. And so that's an example from my youth. Cool. So that's some really great stuff there about melodies. Lots of songwriters, including me when I started out, used to think or do think a lot about choosing chord progressions and then adding a melody on top. And my dad is very old-fashioned, and he thinks that modern music is the devil's work. So it's a little bit of a disappointment to him that I've ended up working in modern music, of all the things. But there's this graphic that I really love from a book by Philip Ball, and it shows the most common chord movements according to frequency. So the arrows, the heavy arrow, the big arrow is the chord change that happens most often. And so you can see, and I take delight in showing him this diagram, the Baroque and the pop diagrams are really pretty similar. there are some little distinctions. So we don't get much going from. There's some of these areas are a little different in Baroque, but the heaviest movement, the most common movement in both is still 5-1, 1-5. Pop music's got slightly more 4-5 and slightly more 4-1. But they are pretty similar in terms of the chord movements, as one might expect, given the fact that we're still operating in a tonal situation. Let me just hide that. What would you say? What advice might you have about chords that we could connect with classical composition, given that perhaps early composers were not thinking in terms?
Yes. Well, actually, if you can put that graphic back up, I want to point out something really important. So if you look on the left where it says Baroque, and you look at the diagram there, find Roman numeral 5, the V, on the left side, and then in the center, you see Roman numeral 4, 5, and then 4. And you'll notice that according to the arrows, and I would agree with this, most of the time, the movement goes from a 4 chord to a 5 chord. And very rarely does it go the other way around, from 5 to 4. Now, if you look over to the right, where it says pop, popular music, you'll see that the line that goes from 5 to 4 is a little thicker now. In fact, I think that that line is probably not thick enough. I think that should be a big, bold line arrow going from 5 to 4, because it is very common to hear 5 going to 4 in rock music, certainly in ballads. You hear it all the time. You hear it, it exists in every blues tune, like every 12 bar blues has 5 going to 4. 5 doesn't go to 1. I mean, unless you alter the 12 bar, but the original 12 bar blues, it's 5 going to 4. 5 doesn't go back to 1. More modern versions, sometimes they'll put 5 to 1 right at the end, but typically it's 5 to 4. Okay, now in the Baroque era, it was very rare. In fact, I would be surprised. I know there are instances of it, but I'm surprised there's even an arrow there at all, because it is so incredibly rare. And this whole thing about 5 going to 4 or 4 going to 5 is about how chords move traditionally in the Baroque era, in the classical era, and chords typically progress from one category of chord to another. So if you can take away the graphic, I'm going to draw you a picture, another way to see this, okay? Really, you can put every chord every chord that exists in a song or a key into one of 3 categories. T stands for tonic. Okay, that would be like the 1 chord, and substitutes for the 1 chord, like 6 is sometimes a substitute for 1. Okay, then you have subdominant. That would be anything that's not in that category or this category. Okay, so that's 4, 2, sometimes 6, sometimes 3, but 4 and 2 for sure go in that category. Okay. Over here is what are called dominant function chords. And in this family of chords, that's typically the 5 chord and the 7 chord if that chord is diminished. Okay. So in a chord progression, chords move this way: tonic to a subdominant chord or chords, from subdominant chords to dominant function chords, and from dominant chords to tonic chords. Now, why do we care? Because we care because you've heard this a billion times. Okay, so if I play this, listen to its emotion. Okay, listen to the general feeling. I'm going to play in the key of G major. Okay, tonic, subdominant, dominant, back to tonic. Okay, that's the typical cheesy little chord progression. Chords moving this way. Now, there are lots of variations of this, but a chord progression always moves in, the true meaning of the term progression always moves in this order. Okay. Never backwards, ever. Okay. If you do go backwards, like you would get in blues, in most pop or rock ballads, they typically do go backwards, where it's tonic to dominant, dominant to subdominant, and subdominant back to tonic. It's the same thing in reverse, and it completely changes the emotion when you go the other way around. So all I'm going to do now, I'm going to write out what I did first. We had G, C, and D. Okay. G was the tonic, C was subdominant, that was the 4 chord, and the D chord was dominant, G, C, D. If we reverse the order, we have G, then going to dominant, D, then D going to subdominant, C. Listen to what happens when we reverse these 2 chords. We go this way instead of this way. Okay. So here was the original. That's progression. Tonic, subdominant, dominant. Now I'm going to reverse the order. That feeling right there feels very different. It has a little bit of this melancholy-like sound. Why? It's exactly the same chords. We didn't change any chords. We only changed the order from progression to retrogression. So when you look at rock ballads, you'll hear that many times. It's almost always in a major key, and it's almost always in retrogression. Okay, that's not a happy song. It's not like we're at a funeral or anything, but it's not happy the way this is. Right? That's like nursery rhyme happy. Okay, so this retrogression, taking the same content that we had from classical music, same content, playing it backwards, okay, gives you a different feeling. And it's using exactly the same chords. We're just changing the order. That makes a big, big difference in terms of how people approach chord progressions today from how they did it 300 years ago. So that's one big difference. Another big difference, as I said earlier today, is that chords in the Baroque era did not exist as a concept. That happened much later in the classical era. And the other thing is that today, very often, especially guitar players, they think in chords first and then improvise or create a melody later. Like that never happened in the Baroque era. One, because there were no such things as chord. They always started with a melody first, then harmonized the melody. In the classical era, they now did have chords as a concept, but typically it was still melody first. Now let's figure out what chords make that melody sound good or appropriate, okay? Or you can conceive of both melody and chords at the same time. You're creating them at the same time. But very often today, it's let's get some chords that sound cool and let's just make stuff up for a melody, and then that's how we're going to put the song together. That's kind of the common approach that people have, and the original approach is kind of lost on a lot of more modern day songwriters. And not that the other way isn't okay, but why not have 2 ways of doing things instead of 1 if they both yield a good result?
So something I want to particularly pick up on what you just said is the progression and retrogression thing, because when I learned this actually from you a few years ago, it definitely blew my mind, because I'd spent, like many guitarists, quite a number of years looking for interesting chord progressions. And I like the sound of non-diatonic chord progressions, and that's all well and good. But if you have a whole set of songs that have these very complex chord progressions, they all end up sounding the same. So the effect that you were trying to get away from, which was things sounding really predictable, you've recreated in another form. So you know, if you have too many songs in a row that have really complex chord progressions, they start sounding a little. The effect becomes a little similar from one to the other. Plus, I guess what I was going for when I was trying to find non-standard chord progressions, even though I didn't really know the terms to express what I was doing back in those days, was to find expressive chord progressions. But thinking, oh, G, C, and D, that's been done before, and therefore discarding it is very topsy-turvy. So the point you make about how the retrogression really changes the effect, thinking at that level is a lot more powerful than thinking at the level of the individual chord, which is where many of us, me included, start out. So I just wanted to particularly pick up on that for anyone that's watching. Right. Probably got time for one more question. If anyone watching has a question for Tom Hess before we wrap up, probably now is the time to put it in the chat. But I'm really curious, in your own back catalogue, how much have you drawn on the types of device that we've discussed? And are these ideas at the forefront of your mind when you're composing? Do you have some favorite moments in your catalogue that you crafted using some of these ideas and devices that you would be willing to tell us about?
Sure. Well, on my records albums, there is the neoclassical stuff, which is basically Baroque era like stuff, played on electric guitar with distortion, kind of fast. There's a lot of counterpoint there in the other lines and the harmonies and the bass line. So it's very much Baroque, kind of like the Ingve stuff. It's very similar. It's based primarily on Baroque era music. I mean, the structure is Baroque, the harmonies are Baroque, the instrumental figures are most often Baroque. The counterpoint for sure is from the Baroque era. So in the neoclassical stuff that I've written and played, it's mainly from that era. Now on the more expressive stuff, which is the stuff I care about more, at least in the stuff that I write, that comes from the Romantic era. I mean, for me, the inspiration and the taking of ideas and concepts are mostly from the 19th century. Chopin, for example, Brahms, some Wagner stuff, Franz Liszt, though very late Beethoven era stuff, the end of his career. Those concepts are very different than the Baroque. They had some counterpoint, but there were less. But there was this massively expanded harmonic language. So instead of just having diatonic chords, there would be all kinds of other harmonic concepts that allowed them and anyone else to have a much wider palette in terms of the numbers of different kinds of emotions that you could express, but it also made the expression of those emotions more easy. It's like if you were learning a language and you had only 1,000 words in your vocabulary, you'd be pretty limited to express yourself accurately. Simple emotions like anger or happiness might be, 1,000 words might be enough. But more complex emotions, more nuanced ways of feeling or expressing things, 1,000 words might not be quite enough. You might need more to be more accurate and more precise in exactly what you're trying to express. And I think that is one of the greatest things about the Romantic era. That's why their music tends to be a lot more emotional in the 19th century than it was, let's say, in the 18th century in the classical era. So a lot of harmonic language, a lot of more chromaticism, use of modulating pitch function was more common in the Romantic era than in previous eras. Still some counterpoint, but chromaticism, going out of the key, greater use of rhythm, greater use of different dynamic levels. In the Baroque era, the music, there wasn't really a lot of difference in dynamic level because the instruments, some of them, like some of the keyboard instruments, like the harpsichord or clavichord, didn't really have a dynamic range. The instruments pretty much played all the notes at the same volume. It wasn't until the piano was invented later that they had more composers and performers had more control over how loud or how soft they could play. With the harpsichord, it's one volume the whole time. They didn't have pianos in 1685. Wasn't invented yet. Okay, so the dynamic range was more flat. The harmonic language was more simple. Rhythms were typically more simple. There was Baroque era composers had to work very hard to express detailed emotions. Now, some of the best ones did, but they had less tools in the toolbox to do that. However, as a result, they got really, really good at using the tools that they had. I mean, they were the absolute supreme masters of it. In the Romantic era, you had so many more tools that it was easier to be expressive. And that's what attracted me about that era, Chopin's music in particular. As far as if you were looking for one song or one track of mine that would be the best example of where I've used 19th century Romantic era concepts in modern music, it'd be a piece of music that I wrote called The Cynic, the Sad, and the Fallen. It's one track off my Opus 2 record. So The Cynic, the Sad, and the Fallen off of the Hess Opus 2 album. That would be the one where there are the most concepts from the Romantic era used on guitar in modern in a modern style.
Thank you. That was very interesting. I absolutely love all this stuff, and I went to do a master's in composition, and I thought I would learn all of this, but I didn't, because I think that's what you learn in undergraduate. Graduate for masters, you just have to take whatever knowledge you've got and try and come up with a portfolio. So for me, all of this stuff is brilliant, and I could definitely spend all day discussing it. But we don't have you all day. So, but not only have you given us all this insight and great tools that we can explore in our own writing, but you also have something else for people. I'm just going to show this.
Yes, this is called the Fretboard Freedom Blueprint. So this has to do with being able to easily learn and visualize where scale patterns are on the guitar. Now, this is not an e-guide with a bunch of scales and saying, here's the Dorian scale, go learn it. That's not what this is. This is about taking scales and scale patterns and shapes and getting you to be able to internalize them so that when you close your eyes, you can visualize the entire guitar. You know where these things are. You can get from one spot to the other. You don't have to sit there and try and figure it out and wonder, okay, I'm here. I want to go up there. What is the next scale position? I don't know. Well, you want to eliminate this hesitation when you're playing because you're trying to figure it out or remember where you can go next. That is the purpose of this ebook. It's totally free. You could download it at the link on your screen, and that will help you to be able to actually visualize and internalize so that you can immediately recall those scales on the guitar as you play or as you write songs. Because there's nothing worse when you're feeling inspired or you're improvising, or you're trying to write something and you have to stop because you don't remember, okay, where is that thing again? I don't know. And that just kills the whole flow of what it is you're trying to play or you're trying to write.
Thank you. So if anyone missed that, I'm going to put that panel up again at the end. So you'll be able to grab it again. I also have something for people watching. My thing is about lyrics, which we've not discussed at all. But if you are new to lyric writing, there's actually a number of respects in which we can think about lyrics in an almost comparable way to melody, in some of the ways that Tom Hess was talking about melody, certainly in terms of phrase length, in terms of how the shape of the words has its own inherent melody, in terms of what level of tension we can build up with the words that we're choosing. In the case of lyrics, it's going to be narrative tension primarily, but and if you don't know what that might refer to, then you should get the ebook. Basically, when I started writing lyrics, I didn't really know anything formal about songwriting, and it's totally fine to start that way. But if I'd known the stuff that's in this, I would have written much better songs much more quickly. And there are ideas in here that you don't need to be talented or a genius or a musical prodigy to be able to apply. They're simply going to make you be able to communicate your ideas more directly and more powerfully, and people are going to remember your songs and enjoy them. So grab that there. And it simply remains for me now to say thank you very much to Tom Hess. I was looking forward to today and I have thoroughly enjoyed it. So thank you very much to everyone who's been watching us. I am going to put up the panel here that has both of these ebooks that you can get. So I'll leave that up there for a few seconds and you can grab those now. And I'll also paste the links into the chat at the end. Now, I hope that you go and listen to all the music that you're playing or writing right now and think about those concepts. I was making a ton of notes. So yeah, perhaps I'll paste a few of them. But that was really great. I thoroughly enjoyed it. Thank you very much, Tom Hess.
Thank you.
Thank you guys for watching.